The next talk is on tighter bounds on multi-party coin flipping via augmented weak martingales and differentially private sampling. It's work by Nicolas Makrianis, Amos Beimel, Iftach Heitner, and Eran Omri. And Nico will give the talk.
Hi, thank you. I'm Nikos, and I'll be talking about coin flipping. So coin flipping is a very important and fundamental primitive in cryptography with many applications. So let's dive right into the flavor of coin flipping we're going to be interested in. Let's talk about fair two-party coin flipping protocols. So these are protocols between two parties. Let's call them Alice and Bob that satisfy a number of requirements. First, we have correctness. So an honest execution yields a common uniform output. Security for Bob is defined by assuming that Alice is a malicious entity that deviates from the protocol arbitrarily. And we say that the protocol is epsilon fair if for every efficient adversary, the distribution of the honest party's output is epsilon close to the uniform distribution. So in particular, I should emphasize that the honest party must output a bit no matter what, even if a cheat is detected or the protocol is aborted prematurely. Right, so let me tell you what is known about these fair two-party protocols. So there's a classic result by Cleve which states that the optimal bias, so how much the honest party's output deviates from the uniform distribution, is at least 1 over R, so 1 over the number of rounds for any two-party protocol. This was complemented about 10 years ago by Moran, Naor, and Segev, who showed that under suitable cryptographic assumptions, there is a protocol with bias 1 over R. So these two results complement each other and show that, in fact, the 1 over R bound is tight. So we look at multi-party protocols, which are defined analogously. So the honest parties must output the same bit at the end of the execution, and a strict subset of parties cannot bias the honest party's output by more than epsilon. So in this talk, we considered the all but one corruption regime. So all of the parties try to attack, to bias the output of a single honest party. Let me try and convey what is known about this problem in a picture. So we're going to fill this graph with protocols and their associated bias. So on the x-axis, we have the number of parties as a function of the number of rounds. On the y-axis, we have the bias of the protocols we're going to fill in. So first, as I mentioned earlier, there's this 1 over R bound from Cleve that can be extended to any number of parties. So this region is unachievable for fair two-party protocols. There's the majority protocol of Averbuch et al. This is an upper bound, which states that for any number of parties, we can guarantee bias of at most 1 over square root the number of rounds. So we have the lower bound of Cleve, the upper bound of Averbuch et al., and the question is, where does the truth lie? So in the past decade, there's been a lot of work on this question. Essentially, the problem is settled for 2 and 3 parties. And we know we can do better than 1 over square root of R as long as we have fewer than log R parties. And little is known about the rest of this range. So in our work, we show an impossibility result. We show an attack for a wide range of parameters. For instance, if the number of rounds is polynomially bounded by the number of parties, then 1 over square root of R, the protocol of Averbuch et al. Is essentially tight. A bit more formally, we show that for any n-party R-round coin flipping protocol, there is an efficient adversary that can bias the output of the honest party by 1 over square root of r times log r to the k, where k is the smallest value such that n to the k is greater than r. What this means is that 1 over square root of r is tight for a large enough number of parties if we disregard the logarithmic terms. R bound is meaningful for any number of parties greater than log r. Of course, there is some degradation in the bias, as was shown in the previous picture. And in reality, our theorem actually holds for fewer corruptions, fewer than all but one, where we can corrupt any, where the honest parties is a vanishing fraction of n. So to show this result, we have two technical contributions which we believe can be of broader interest. The first one is a new result about martingale-like sequences, which I'm going to discuss at length. The second one, which I'm not going to have time to talk about in this talk, is a sampling technique that uses differential privacy. So for those who are familiar with differential privacy, coin flipping doesn't really have any privacy or differential privacy concern. Rather, we use differential privacy as a tool in our attack. So that was our results. So let me tell you what I'm going to say in the rest of this talk. So I'm going to present an attack from the 90s of Cleven and Pagliazzo, which is an inefficient attack, so in a different computational model, but it's relevant to our work because it's our inspiration and our starting point. Then I'm going to talk about how the steps we took to make to achieve an efficient attack, and finally, I hope to have the time to give you a snippet of the actual attack. So let's talk about Cleven and Pagliazzo. Let me give you the premise. So we're in the two-party setting. We have two parties, and the adversarial model is the following. The adversary is unbounded computationally and is limited to fail-stop behavior, meaning that the only malicious behavior he can do is abort prematurely. So Cleven and Pagliazzo showed that in this model, the best possible bias you can achieve is 1 over square root of r. And I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to try and show you why this theorem is true. So let's introduce some notation. So we have two parties. They exchange messages in a number of rounds. At the end of the execution, they compute a bit out, which denotes the always common prescribed output. And because this is a fair protocol, we can assume that at every round, they compute what we call backup values. These are bits that the parties are instructed to output in case the computation is aborted prematurely. For instance, if, say, Bob, a malicious Bob, refuses to send the second message, then Alice is instructed to output the second backup value. Right. So a last piece of notation is the expected outcome sequence. This is the expectation of the output given the messages sent until any given round. So there's nothing mysterious about this sequence. It's just what we can tell about the distribution of the output given the messages we've seen. This sequence is a strong martingale. So this is the standard flavor of martingale, so don't be put off by the strong qualifier. And it satisfies the martingale property, which is that the expectation of any given variable, given the history of the variables, is equal to xi minus 1. Another observation about this sequence is that it travels a constant distance, meaning that it starts at half, because it's the expectation of a uniform bit, and it ends up at either 0 or 1, because the transcript determines the output, which is a fixed bit. So Cleven and Pagliazzo showed that for any such sequence, there is a gap of magnitude 1 over square root of r between adjacent variables. And they exploit this gap in order to deduce a bias in the protocol. So how do they do this? So recall we have these backup outputs in case the protocol aborts, and we have this expected outcome sequence. The attack goes as follows. Let's say that A is the bad guy, Alice is the bad guy. She aborts without sending the ith message if a gap is detected in the expected outcome. So let's see why this gives rise to a bias. So first, we know that there's a gap without loss of generality at some point because of the theorem of Cleven and Pagliazzo. Second, unless the protocol is in some sense pathological and there is a different attack that I don't want to get into, we can assume that the expectation of the backup is equal to the expected outcome. Therefore, the backup trails behind the expected outcome, which is half overall, by 1 over square root of r. This is what gives rise to the bias in the attack. So I made a fuss about the fact that this attack is in a different model and it's inefficient and everything, but I haven't really said anything about the efficiency. The reason this attack is not efficient is because, in general, it is not efficient to compute the expected outcome because it might entail inverting some one-way function, for instance. So in the second part of this talk, I'm going to tell you how the steps we kind of followed in order to achieve an efficient attack for multi-party protocols. Our strategy is to play with this expected outcome. We want to get an expected outcome sequence that is efficiently computable, contrary to what was going on in the previous attack, that exhibits large gaps, and the gap can be exploited to attack. So the way we do this is we're going to tinker with the conditioning in the expectation. So a natural attempt, instead of conditioning on the transcript, which is a natural attempt is to condition on a function of the transcript. For instance, the backup values. A nice property of this definition, so now the xi is just the expectation of the output given the backup values I've computed at any given time. So a nice thing about this sequence is that it's not too hard to see that it also satisfies the strong Martingale property. But unfortunately, it's still hard to compute if the number of rounds is super logarithmic in the security parameter. And the reason is that viewed as a function, the support of this expectation would be too large. It would be a string of a super logarithmic number of bits. With that in mind, we want to avoid keeping track of long strings of information, and we aggregate the information given by the backup values in the following way. We define the expected outcome sequence to be the expectation of the output given the new backup that we observe, as well as the expected outcome at the previous round. The good thing about this sequence is that now it's sufficiently computable because we can control the size of its support. Actually, we need to do some discretization, but it's not that important to talk about that now. So this thing is efficiently computable, but now we run into a different obstacle, the fact that it's no longer a strong martingale. Now this sequence satisfies the weak martingale property, which states that the expectation of xi conditional on the previous value, and only the previous value, is equal to xi minus 1. And it is open whether it has gaps. So, okay, we didn't give up. We came up with a natural solution, even though perhaps not as clean. Specifically, what we did is we append a quantity that we call the sum of squares, which corresponds to the distance the sequence has traveled so far. And we show that this sequence satisfies our needs. First, we observe that it's efficiently computable for the same reason as the previous case, because we can control the size of the support. And we observe that it lies somewhere in between the weak martingale of the second attempt and the strong martingale of the first. We call such sequences augmented weak martingales if they satisfy the following requirements. So the expectation of any given variable, given the previous one, as well as the sum of squares, is equal to xi minus 1. And we show that for any such sequence, if the sequence travels a constant distance, then the sum of squares is greater than 1, which by averaging implies that we get a 1 over square root of r gap between adjacent variables. Also, I'd like to mention that we have a simple proof that uses elementary observations contrary to Cleves and Impagliazzo's theorem. So all of this discussion should raise an eyebrow, because I seem to be saying that we obtain a two-party 1 over square root of r attack. So let's bring back the attack from Cleves and Impagliazzo. The question is, can we plug and play? Can we take the sequence we just defined, just put it in this attack and say, okay, we achieved the bias of 1 over square root of r? Well, we shouldn't be able to do it, assuming some standard crypto, because we know that 1 over square root of r is not tight for the two-party case. In fact, the gap is unexploitable in this setting, in the two-party setting, for reasons that I don't want to get into. Not that I don't want to, I don't have time to. So there's no bias in the two-party case, but there is a bias that we can exploit this gap in the multi-party case. And let's turn to the multi-party case right away. So I'm going to present the attack when we have more parties than we have rounds. Okay? More parties than rounds. N is the number of parties, R is the number of rounds. The attack goes as follows. So the adversary chooses a random element, a random party to corrupt, to attack, and corrupts all other parties. Then, at each round, the adversary is instructed to compute the expected outcome given the backups of half and only half of the corrupted parties. What happens here is that at the beginning of the protocol, the adversary chooses half of its corrupted parties, it puts them in the bag, seals the bag, and never looks at the bag again. Then, if a gap is detected in the expected outcome sequence, the adversary aborts all of the parties, including the ones in the bag. So we show that this attack yields a bias of magnitude 1 over square root of r. And some elements of the proof go something like this. So we know that this attack is efficient because we have the augmented weak martingale construction that I was talking about earlier. Also, by the theorem that we showed, we know that there exists a 1 over square root of r gaps between adjacent variables. Then, because the honest party, for all intents and purposes, is just a random element in the ignored set, we can deduce that the expectation of its backup is just the average backup of the ignored set. And now, because we have more parties than we have rounds, by concentration, we can show that the honest party's backup trails behind the expected outcome. So I'm hand-waving some things right now, but I hope this is honest enough. So this was the basic idea, so let me very briefly give you almost nothing about the general case. So the general case is significantly more involved, because in reality our attacking strategy exploits tuple backups in a recursive manner. This is where we also lose where we have the degradation in the bias. And the recursion, these attacks that happen one after the other, use the differential private sampling that I mentioned at the beginning. Right, so let me give you the summary of the talk. So we showed that for any n-party R-round coin flipping protocol, there is an efficient attack of that magnitude. We defined augmented weak martingales, and we showed that they have large gaps. We also defined the differential privacy-based sampling technique, which I didn't talk really about at all. And let me leave you with some open questions. So can we meet the upper or lower bound for the remaining range of parameters? What can we say about different corruption regimes? So in our case, we're looking at n minus little o of n corruption, so almost everyone. But what can we say about 2/3 corrupt, for example? What about simply weak martingales, non-augmented? Do they have large gaps? And finally, can we find other applications for 2 and 3? So the weak martingales and the sampling technique. Thank you.
Question?
So is there a chain of n-1 of n-2 of corruption? Do you have a conjecture of what would be the tight result in there?
Yes, I believe that little o of 1 should be right on 1 over r.
Okay.
So if you have constant, and that the diagonal should be pushed about between log r and log r.
Okay.
This is, like it should look like something like that. Yeah.
Why?
Why? So the reason is it's what we did not use in this attack is the fact that the parties, when some of the parties abort, the remaining parties start running sub-protocols. So these sub-protocols, in order to determine the output, should leak a lot of information about the expected outcome. And so we didn't use that in our attack. We only used the output of the sub-protocol. And I believe that it should give you a stronger attack.
So you think you can have a stronger attack, but you also think that would be a stronger feasibility result?
I also believe, yeah, I also believe that for constant parties it should be, the only reason is I don't see any difference between 2, 3 and constant, right? I don't have a very sophisticated answer. Yes?
So you didn't tell us why the thing breaks down at 2 parties because you didn't have time. Let me see if I guessed.
Yeah.
With only 2 parties, in the case that is an abort, then that party knows he's the only good guy.
Uh-huh.
He can't flip the coin. Why does so there's no bias?
No, that would actually give you a terrible bias if you did that.
No, okay.
Yeah.
If there's only one party who's honest,
Yes.
then unless I misunderstood.
So if we're playing between each other, right? And I learn the output, say that the output is 1, and then I say, oh, okay, I go home now. Then you have to flip a bid, and your bid is going to be biased. You have to do multi-party computation to get the good biases. Yeah.
To be biased is biased compared to fair coin.
Yes. What?
If I'm the only honest party and I flip a coin, it won't be biased.
The abort is conditional, so, well, you can.
So it will, I mean, the coin in and of itself is not biased, but your output is biased.
Because you only flip the coin if the bit was going to be 1 in the end. Otherwise, it's 0 with 50%.
Sorry, okay.
Any further questions? Any more conjectures? All right, let's thank Nicola again.